Hello, and welcome back to the Convict Diaries. I'm Denise, and I'm still, as you can guess, looking at bushrangers. Bushrangers emerged as iconic figures in the colonial histories of both Australia and New Zealand, representing a unique blend of the outlaw and the folk hero during the 18th and 19th century. These frontier outlaws, comparable, I guess, to the American Western bandits or Britain's highwaymen, carved out a piece and a place in both nations' historical narratives. Though their impact and significance differed markedly between the two countries. In Australia, bushranging evolved into a complex social phenomenon, with many outlaws achieving near mythical status or symbols of resistance against the colonial authority. Their exploits ranged from simple cattle theft to daring bank robberies and dramatic confrontations with law enforcement. However, in New Zealand, the experience with bushrangers took a different path. It focused primarily around the goldfields, and it lacked the broader social rebellion that characterised the Australian bushranger. But the legacy of these frontier outlaws continues to captivate public imagination in both nations. While their actions were undeniably criminal, often marked by violence and theft, bushrangers have become powerful symbols of the colonial era's harsh realities and the struggles between authority and resistance. And their stories reveal much about the development of both societies, the environmental challenges, social inequalities, and the complex relationship between the settlers and the law. Even today, bushranger tales remain deeply woven into the cultural fabric of Australia and New Zealand, serving as vivid reminders of their shared yet distinct heritage. This time we're going to look at a notorious Richard Burgess. He was a bushranger in the 19th century Australia and New Zealand. His life was marked by a series of criminal activities that made him one of the most infamous figures of his time. Richard Burgess, he was likely born Richard Hill, and he came into the world on the 14th of February 1829 in London, England. He was born out of wedlock to a guard officer and a lady's maid, and he was raised solely by his mother and never met his father. Burgess's early life was fraught with poverty and hardship. Challenging circumstances steered him towards a life of crime. From a young age, Burgess became involved in pickpocketing and robbery, and at 14 he was jailed and he was flogged for pickpocketing. His criminal activities escalated, and at 16 he had been convicted of theft and sentenced to transportation to New South Wales. He arrived in 1847, and this marked the start of his criminal career abroad. Released on a conditional pardon that barred him from returning home until his sentence expired, Dick Hill, as he was then known, briefly worked as a stonemason before reverting back to his life of crime. His offences included robbery, forgery, rustling, and murder. Described as a smart, dapper little fellow, standing only 5 foot 4.5 inches tall, with a fresh complexion, brown hair and hazel eyes. That was according to a wanted poster. Hill found ample opportunities to exploit the Victorian goldfield diggers. The proceeds of his crimes were squandered on gambling, liquor, and women. In 1852, Hill was sentenced to 10 years for a robbery he steadfastly claimed he did not commit. During his imprisonment in Melbourne jail and the brutal prison hulks, he endured harsh conditions, and twice he attempted to escape. including a notorious 1956 breakout attempt led by the infamous Bushranger, Captain Melville or Frank McCullum. The escape resulted in 3 deaths, including a policeman. However, Hill and the other defendants avoided the gallows on legal technicalities during the subsequent murder trial. After his early release in 1859 on a ticket of leave, Hill was arrested within a month for armed robbery. He used an alias to conceal his criminal history and received a relatively light sentence. Upon his discharge from Pentridge Stockade in October 1861, Hill sought to evade police surveillance by heading to the Otago goldfields. In January 1862, there he joined forces with various Australian associates targeting miners for robbery. His closest accomplice was Thomas Kelly, alias Noon, a fellow inmate from Pentridge. Burgess was known for his ruthless and violent methods, which earned him a fearsome reputation. In 1862, he had emigrated to New Zealand to join the Otago gold rush. There he reconnected with Thomas Noon, an acquaintance from their time in jail in Australia. The pair was soon arrested and sentenced to 3.5 years in Dunedin jail. Upon their release in September 1865, authorities escorted them to Otago province border before letting them go. In Hokitika, Burgess and Kelly staked a claim at Kania, with Noon having taken the name Thomas Kelly. They worked to their claim until just before Christmas, when they carried out a series of robberies. During this time, Burgess was living with a woman named Carrie, whom he abandoned when she became pregnant with his child. His plan was to rob the bank at Okarito, south of Kitiki, and then move back to Australia with her before she got pregnant. That was his plan. Burgess also rekindled his association with William, also known as Philip Levi, with whom he had prior dealings in both Australia and New Zealand. In Greymouth, Burgess and Levy grew closer as they engaged in further ventures. In April 1866, the gang was completed by another recent arrival from Victoria, Joseph Sullivan, who had been transported from England in 1840 for robbery. In May 1866, the Burgess gang had embarked on a crime spree on the west coast of the South Island that would culminate with the murder of many men on the Morgatapu track. These murders took place on the 12th and 13th of June 1966 and near Nelson on the South Island of New Zealand. The heinous crimes occurred in 2 separate attacks that resulted in the deaths of 5 individuals, and the victims' names were James Battle, George Dudley, John Kempthorne, James de Pontius, and Felix Mattel. The brutality of these murders shocked the public and led to a massive manhunt for Burgess and his accomplices. It was June 6, 1866, when the group sailed to Nelson with plans to do several bank robberies in the area. However, these plans were ultimately abandoned. Instead, the gang travelled to Canvastown, a small settlement east of Nelson, accessible only via the remote Magatapu track. Burgess' reign of terror ended with his capture on the 19th of June in 1866. The gang's depositions proceeding began on the 2nd of August, generating significant public excitement. During this time, it was revealed Joseph had betrayed his accomplices by informing on them. Joseph Sullivan had betrayed his accomplices by informing on them. On the 7th of August, Burgess wrote a lengthy statement titled The Confessions of Burgess the Murderer, in which he detailed his numerous crimes while exonerating Kelly and Levi. The case was brought before the Supreme Court with a special sitting convened in Nelson on the 12th of September, presided over by Mr. Justice Johnston of Wellington. Sullivan, who had cooperated extensively with the police, faced threats of execution despite claiming he had to deal with the government. Eventually, the authorities supported this plea for clemency, and Sullivan's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. On the 5th of August 1866, Burgess, Kelly and Levi were executed. Before ascending the scaffold, Burgess declared he had no more fear of death than of going to a wedding. He selected the central noose and kissed it, calling it a prelude to heaven. Hysterical Kelly was unable to walk and had to be carried up, while Levi calmly protested his innocence. There was a delay as each made their final statements, with Kelly still speaking when, at 8:30 a.m., the hangman drew the bolt to open the trapdoor. Burgess and Levi appeared to die instantly, but Kelly's death was more gruesome. The hangman had to jump down and swing on Kelly's legs to end his struggles. After the legally mandated 30 minutes, the bodies were taken down for a coroner's examination, and they were then buried in the prison yard. Sullivan's pardon in 1874 came with the condition that he never returned to New Zealand. Disguised, he was taken to Mount Eden Prison in Auckland, where he waited transportation overseas. His first attempt to leave failed when he was recognised and denied passage. Finally, on the 31st of March, he was deported aboard the Hindustan, bound for London. By December 1874, Sullivan had to return to Australia, having been arrested at his wife's house. Under the influx of Criminal Prevention Act, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Upon his release in 1870, numerous books, films and folklore. While his actions were undoubtedly criminal, they also highlighted the harsh conditions and the lawlessness of the Australian and New Zealand frontier during the 19th century. So I hope you enjoyed that. I didn't know that our bushrangers actually also bushranged in New Zealand. That was quite interesting. So I look forward to talking to you next time, and I shall see you then when we do another, probably bushranger. Thank you. Goodbye.